All right, so we've been in a series called The Miracles of Jesus, and here's the miracles we've done so far. Week 1, we did the wedding at Cana, so Jesus turning water into wine. Week 2, we did the healing of Jairus' daughter and also the healing of the bleeding woman. And I believe week 3, Jim led us through Jesus calming the storm, right? And so today we're going to be on the feeding of the 5,000. But just to remind y'all what the purpose of miracles are, this is a bit of review, but there's 5 things as a teaching team that we've kind of put together as reasons why the miracles exist and what their purpose are. First is to arouse curiosity. If you don't read the scriptures and get extremely curious or borderline weirded out by what Jesus is doing, then you're not reading them. This is crazy stuff. The second thing is to display power and authority. The third is to affirm the identity of Jesus. The fourth is to reveal his compassion. So many of the healings that Jesus does are so tender towards people who have probably been cast away from families, cast away from society. And here is Jesus, the King, tenderly meeting people, healing them. And lastly, to inspire worship. So if I had to summarize kind of all of those down into one sentence, here's kind of what I put. The purpose of the miracles of Jesus was to validate the message he was preaching, to validate the message he was preaching. So here's kind of a stupid example I use quite often to talk about the miracles of Jesus. You can look at my stature. I'm about 5'7" on a good day. If I told you I could dunk a basketball, would you believe me? Some of y'all are liars and some of y'all are mean. That's true. But here's probably the first thing you would ask of me. Prove it. Dunk a basketball, right? I won't believe you until you actually do what you say you can do, right? And so when Jesus comes onto the scene and he says, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And not only the kingdom is at hand, but the king is here. The rightful question people should ask is, prove it. And that's what the miracles do, right? They prove who Jesus is. They prove that what he is saying, the message, is true because he's able to do all these different styles and kinds of miracles. And so that leads to kind of 2 dangers when we approach the miracles of Jesus. Because if you only care about Jesus' miracles, but you don't care about what Jesus taught, then you have missed the point of the miracle. Like, you've missed it. But also, if you only care about what Jesus said and you dismiss the miracles, then you have dismissed the authority of the message that he preached. So we need both of them, right? We need to not only care about miracles, and we need to not only care about his teaching, we need to see them as linked together, as one proving the other. So today we're going to talk about probably Jesus' most famous miracle, the feeding of the 5,000. If you grew up in the church, this is like go-to Sunday school lesson, right? And it's really famous because this is Jesus' largest scaled miracle. I mean, most of the time his miracles are done individually, one-to-one, or maybe a small group. But this one, right, thousands of people were involved. And so it would make sense how the word of this miracle has gotten out big time. And I want to do a quick recap of the Gospel of John up to chapter 5. So far, Jesus has performed 3 miracles in the Gospel of John. Jesus turns water into wine at the wedding of Cana, which is what Matt taught on. Jesus heals an official's son from a distance, proving that Jesus doesn't have to be in the physical proximity of somebody to heal them, which is crazy. And then third, the healing of a lame man at the pool of Bethesda. And so before we dive into John 6, there's 2 pieces of context that are going to be really helpful as we study this. That's going to help us see the bigger meaning of what's going on in this miracle. So here's the first bit of context. At the end of John chapter 5, Jesus tells the Pharisees that they aren't truly following the law of Moses. Now, if you know much about the Pharisees, that would be about the rudest, most mean thing you could say to them. Because to them, to be a Jew meant that you strictly followed the law of Moses. And so that's what the Pharisees did. To a T, they followed the law, or at least they claimed to follow the law. And here's what Jesus said. In your strict adherence of trying to follow the law, you have actually missed the point of what the law was pointing to. Because if you would have believed what Moses wrote, then you would believe in me. Right? And so Jesus is telling them that they're actually missing the point of what Moses' whole ministry was about. And then the second bit of context that's going to help us a lot in this chapter is remembering the Exodus event. So the Exodus event was one of the biggest, if not the biggest event that happens to the nation of Israel in the Old Testament. It's constantly referred back to in basically every book. And just in case you're new or you're unfamiliar with that story, here's just a really simple thing. God's people were enslaved by Egypt for 400 years. And then God hears the cries of his people. He raises up Moses as a leader to lead his people into freedom. But if you read the story of Exodus, it's a super messy rescue mission, right? Like as soon as they get out of Egypt, so many problems happen. They end up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. A whole generation actually dies before entering the promised land. Moses, the leader, actually doesn't enter the promised land. And so it's a really messy story, but it's a really important story. Because here's what John is going to be doing for us in chapter 6. John is going to be showing us that Jesus is not just a prophet like Moses. He's actually better than Moses. That he didn't just come to teach the word of God, he actually is the word of God himself. That he's not just similar to Moses' ministry, he's actually the fulfillment of the ministry of Moses. So with that, let's go ahead and read John chapter 6. And if you're confused, I promise you'll understand more as we read about what I'm talking about. So John chapter 6, we're going to be in verses 1 through 4 to start. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. And we're going to pause right there. So the text starts by telling us that after Jesus finished talking with the religious leaders in chapter 5, he gets into a boat and he goes to the other side of the sea. And where Jesus goes, if you read the Gospels, you'll pick up on this. Large crowds are always following where Jesus went. People wanted to be around him. And I think it's hard for us to understand just how popular Jesus was during his public ministry. He was must-see TV. Wherever he went, that's where all of the crowds went because it says that they wanted to see more of his miracles. So to go back to what I said at the beginning, the crowds are missing the point of Jesus' miracles. Right? They weren't following Jesus because they were excited about the message he was preaching. They were following Jesus, basically saying, all right, magician, do it again. Do another crazy thing that's going to wow us all, right? And so they're missing the point. But instead of performing another miracle, Jesus descends up on a mountain and begins to teach his disciple. And then John gives us an interesting detail that seems kind of random in the text. I don't know if you picked up on this. Look at verse 4 with me. We are told that the timing of this moment was during the Passover event. Now, why include that detail? It seems like not very helpful to what's going on. It seems just kind of a random tidbit of information. But John includes this because he's trying to get you to connect what we're about to read with the story of the Exodus. Because the Passover celebrated how on the 10th plague, right, that the striking of the firstborn son, if you were an Israelite and you sacrificed the lamb, you put the blood of the lamb over your doorpost, the angel of death passed over your house, right? And so it was a yearly celebration of the Jews to remind themselves of the mercy of God towards the Israelite nation. So as we read the rest of this passage, John is trying to connect some dots for us as readers that what we should be looking out for. So as we read verses 5 through 15, I'm going to be asking you all to think through and look for how is the ministry of Jesus, and specifically this miracle, similar to the ministry of Moses and also better than the ministry of Moses. So let me keep reading verses 5 through 15. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So picking up in verse 5, right? As Jesus is teaching his disciples, we are told that he looks up and he sees a massive crowd of people coming towards him. And I love that little detail we're given in verse 5, that Jesus looks up and he notices the crowd. Don't you love that about Jesus? Like all throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus notices people. Right? Oftentimes, whenever you're really important in this world, that means you kind of overlook those who are seemingly insignificant. But how completely reversed is that in the ministry of Jesus? Right? And so he notices this large crowd and he looks on them and he looks at them in the middle of his teaching, and he doesn't look at them as somebody who's annoyed, but as somebody who has compassion. Like even in the middle of his teaching, Jesus is willing to be interrupted by their need. I heard one pastor say it like this, and I love this. He says, there was no one more interruptible in the history of the world than Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus' ministry is just full of disruptions of people's needs, and never is he frustrated or mad. He always welcomes the person who disrupts what's going on. And so as Jesus notices the crowd, he sees the problem that is at hand. Most of these people are far away from where they live, and they have nothing to eat. And so Jesus turned to Philip and asked him where they can buy bread to give the people, which is a very funny question, honestly, in the context of what's going on, right? And so Philip tells him that 200 denarii wouldn't even be able to cover the cost of everybody having a snack or even a bite to eat, which 200 denarii was about 8 months worth of wages, right? So about 3/4 of a year worth of wages. And Philip saying that wouldn't even touch the surface of what we had going on. Think of it like this. Imagine if you were at a packed show at Bridgestone Arena, right? And you're there and it's full as you can think it can be. And then all of a sudden someone turns to you and says, man, how are we going to feed all these people? And you're like, what? Like, what do you mean? How are we going to, like, where would you even start? Why is it your responsibility to feed these thousands of people, right? And not only are we told that this impossible question is asked to Philip, but we're actually told that Jesus has a motivation, that he asked Philip to test him, because Jesus already knew what the outcome was going to be. So then the question is, if Jesus already knows the outcome, why ask the question? What's he trying to do here? Well, because he wanted Philip and really all of the disciples to acknowledge that they were in an impossible situation that had no hope of a human solution. No hope, right? No matter what the disciples planned, they couldn't fix the problem in front of them, and that's exactly what Jesus is trying to point out. So after his interaction with Philip, thankfully Andrew comes in to save the day, and Andrew comes onto the scene and he tells Jesus that they sifted through the crowds and they found one boy, the only smart boy, the only smart person in this crowd. And he says, Jesus, don't worry, we've got 5 loaves and 2 fish. But then Andrew says a similar sentiment to what Philip says, right? But even this, I mean, what can this do in view of such great need? Jesus, this is pointless. What are we going to do here, right? And I want to ask you, what would you have done if you were the disciples, if you were there? If you had a group of 5,000 men, which most likely, by the way, was 15 to 20,000 people in total, because during that day, they only counted the men. So we can assume that there's wives, there's children there, right? So there's more than 5,000 people. What would you do in that scenario? Because if you're anything like me, here's my honest to God truth of what I would have done. I would have looked away and said, that's not my problem. I mean, what could I do to help the situation? They were the ones who traveled without food, right? That's their fault. So why is it my responsibility to feed them? And even if I wanted to help, what could I do? I don't have the resources. I don't have enough to actually help the situation, right? But thankfully, Jesus is much different than I am, and he doesn't respond that way. Because in response to the disciples saying that their resources are too limited for the occasion, he tells them to have the crowd sit down in the grass. Now, once again, 15 to 20,000 people. As someone who has had the opportunity to lead large groups of people, that's no small task, by the way. Like reading that detail, getting 15 to 20,000 people to do what you ask them to do, that's hard. And so, but after they sit down, which probably took some time, Jesus takes the scarce resources they had, and it says he prays over them. And then he begins to, and I get this detail from some of the other gospels, he has the disciples begin to pass them out to the groups of people who are sitting in the grass. And in verse 11, there's a detail that I think is worth circling in your Bible. If you do that, it says that they ate as much as they wanted. That's an awesome detail. These people didn't snack, they feasted. They ate to their heart's content. And not only that, but the disciples collect 12 baskets of leftovers when all is said and done. Don't you love it when God flexes like that? Like when he just does stuff like that just to show that he actually provides an abundance, right? Because Jesus didn't just provide enough to get by, he provided to their heart's content. He left each individual completely satisfied with their portion of food. So once again, what's John trying to do? Connect this with the story of Exodus. When the people are wandering in the wilderness and God miraculously provides bread for them. God only provides bread enough for the day, right? So the ministry of Moses, yes, God provided what the people needed. But in the ministry of Jesus, God provides an abundance. Right? It's better than the ministry of Moses. It's different. He's not just another prophet. He is the Messiah who has come. And then as the story ends, we read about how the people begin to get very excited about who Jesus is. So excited, in fact, that they try to go and take him and force him to be king. And don't you just love how wild these people are? Like, they're insane. Because this is, like, think of what just happened. Jesus just does something so miraculous and so powerful, like the world has never seen before. And all of them didn't just see it, they partook in the miracle. And then they say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to try to control that power. Like, we can force him to do what we want. We can force him to be our king. Isn't that crazy to think that they have the power to do that? And yet, how unbelievably relatable is that? We read about the God who does amazing miracles in the scriptures. Or maybe you're part of some kind of small group and you're hearing about how God's answering prayer requests in people's lives. And you're like, that's amazing. God's so powerful. I wonder what he can do for me. I wonder how I can make him my king to do what I want him to do. And rather than seeing the power of God and then coming before him and saying, man, I submit to you, we see the power of God. And in our sin, we come before him and try to make him submit to us. How crazy is that, right? And how relatable is that? And so that's where the story ends. And so the questions I want to ask now is, what can we learn from this text and how can we apply this text? What can we learn and how can we apply this? So here's the first thing. Jesus can do a lot with a little. Jesus can do a lot with a little. Jesus turned a Lunchable into enough food to feed upwards to 20,000 people. Y'all know Lunchables? Yeah, they're awesome. That was like the lunch back in middle school. Actually, I'd still eat those today. But and not only did he feed everyone as much as they wanted, they had leftovers. He can do a lot with a little. You see, the problem with the disciples in this story is that they focused on where they were limited instead of trusting in the unlimited power of Jesus. And when it comes to following Jesus, don't focus on what you lack, focus on who you are with, right? Philip could only focus on the fact that they didn't have enough money. Andrew could only focus on the fact that they didn't have enough food even for one person. And rather than trusting in the God who can provide, they could only see what they were lacking, which led them to feel hopeless and frustrated. Instead of turning to Jesus in their need, they tried to solve the problem themselves, which led to the conclusion that they couldn't fix the problem on their own, even if they wanted to. And I would argue that we struggle with the same thing in our own lives. I mean, isn't it true that the problem that we often face as Christians is that we think that we aren't good enough or that we don't have enough to be used by God? We focus on our imperfections. We focus on where we're limited. We say things like this, man, I love to be used by God, but man, I'm just not that smart. I'm just not very smart. How could he use me? You know, I'm just not a great speaker. I'm not that good looking. I'm not as good as that other person. I still struggle with sin in my life. I don't read my Bible as often as I should. You know, I just started going to church. Who am I to help lead other people and disciple other people? Or I'm just not that popular in my workplace, right? But what if instead of focusing on where we believe we are lacking, we started focusing on the power of Jesus and trusted that he can use you to do miraculous things, not because you're strong, but because he's strong. God's power is greater than your weakness. I mean, think back to Moses at the beginning of the Exodus, right? Moses, I want to use you to free my people. What's the first thing Moses says? You've got the wrong guy. Get the wrong guy, right? And yet we do that all the time. We somehow make our limitations more powerful than God. And in fact, it should be inversed. We should reverse the equation. In fact, if you feel really small and weak, then you are perfectly qualified to be used by God for his grand purposes. Because when God uses weak things like us to do something that only he could do, then he gets the glory, Not us. We don't read the story of the 5,000 and go, wow, Andre the disciple's amazing. We don't do that. We say, man, Jesus is amazing. And that's true of our lives as well. God loves to use weak things for his glory. This is what leads Paul to write in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 27. He says this, but God chose the foolish things of this world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. Here's Ryan's translation of that verse. If you feel like a fool, then you are in a perfect situation to be used by God, because that's who God uses. He uses those who are the most unlikely to do the most unlikely things. And so Jesus can use your small acts of faithfulness to produce big ripple effects in the world. I mean, remember how the miracle started, right? Who is it that began the process of this miracle? One boy with one small lunch. I mean, think about the faith that he needed to give away that lunch. That's like he's the only one in the place with food, and he gives it away. And that seems small and insignificant. And then Jesus takes that small, little, insignificant offering and uses it to produce one of the most memorable miracles in his entire public ministry. Right? Jesus does a lot with a little. So then the question is, what does this look like on a daily basis? Like, how can your Wednesday afternoons be different because of this truth, right? Here's the question. What are some small, faithful acts that you can start doing in your life that you can trust God with? Like inviting a friend to church may seem like a really small thing, but man, what if God used that to bring a non-believer to the faith? You may feel like you don't have that much money to tithe. I say this to our high school students all the time who are making like $70 a month, right? Like they're like, why would I tithe? I can only tithe like $5. It's not about the size of your money. It's about who you're giving it to. God can use a lot with your small little offerings. Inviting your neighbor over for dinner may seem small and insignificant, but what if God used that as an avenue to allow you to share the gospel with them? Small acts can be used by God to do big things. God can do a lot with a little. And then here's the second thing I think we can apply. We have been invited to serve what Jesus has provided. So whenever I was growing up, my family owned a restaurant, and so I got to be the server a lot, which I hated. Honestly, it was my least favorite job in the world. My dad was the chef. He was a mean chef. No, I'm just kidding. He was great. But a lot of times, though, like he would give me the food. I would go out, hand it to somebody. They would eat it. I would go to clean it up, and they would say, this food was amazing. Thank you so much. And you know what I would say? I didn't have any part of that. Like, I didn't do that. Like, all I had to do was take the plate of food and give it to the person. All compliments go to the chef, right? And isn't that a lot of what the disciples are doing in this chapter? Jesus is the one who does the miracle, but he invites the disciples to serve that miracle, right? And then one of my favorite questions to ask when reading the Bible is, especially during the times of the miracles, is whenever Jesus decides not to do something. So as he provides all of this food miraculously, why doesn't he just make it appear before the people? Isn't that the most efficient route? Like if you wanted to feed 20,000 people quickly, probably the slowest way to do it is have people serve it, right? And so why does Jesus do that? Why does he invite the disciples to serve when that's like a pretty slow way to do it? Because he wants his disciples to be a part of the miracle. It's not their job to produce the food, but it is their job to serve the food. And so the question is, what is it that Jesus has invited you and I to serve others? Like what have we been called into as a church? Well, we've been called to give out something that's far greater than earthly bread. Because if you read a few more verses down in John chapter 6, you'll read this verse. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. So what is it that Jesus has provided that we get to serve others? Himself. We get to give people Jesus. We get to tell people the good news of the gospel, that Jesus has died for our sins, rescued us from hell, put us into a relationship with the Father for eternity. We get to serve that to other people, like the disciples served the bread. And so as we look out to this world full of starving people looking for meaning, we have bread that can satisfy, like really satisfy their deepest longings. And then the question is, why would we withhold that bread? Imagine how much different it would be if the story went like this. Jesus provided enough food for 20,000 people, and the disciples hoarded all of the food, and they gave out none of it, and they feasted. That'd be a cruel ending to the story. People are hungry, and they're just keeping the food to themselves. Is that not what we do when we taste the good news of the gospel and keep it to ourselves? We have a chance to serve other people really good news And instead of hoarding it to ourselves, we go, there's enough to share, right? There's enough to have leftovers. And so I want to invite y'all to ask this question. Are you serving up what Jesus has provided? Are you advancing the gospel in places that God has uniquely put you?